Okay, we can begin. It's going to be nice. Thanks for being there. I am really happy to be here at London for a real conference with real people over there. Yes? Yes? Ah, okay. So I am really happy to have real people and not on a screen or a Zoom thing. Let me introduce myself. I am Horacio Gonzalez. As you can maybe hear, I am a Spaniard who has been living in France for over 20 years. So my English accent combines the worst traits of both Spanish and French accents. Sorry about that. I hope it won't bother you too much. I am the leader of the DevRel developer relations team at OVH Cloud. I will talk later about our company. And I am also rather involved in open source meetups and conferences in the far corner of Brittany in France. So, OVH Cloud, I don't know if you know us. We are a cloud provider. We are, in fact, the biggest European cloud provider. We are way smaller than our friends at Google or Amazon or Alibaba, but we are in the top 10 in the world. We have data centers all around the world. We have more than 1.5 million customers. And above all, we have a very complete catalog of services, from bare metal servers to public cloud, private cloud, storage, and almost anything you could need. So next time you are going to deploy an application to build an infrastructure, hey, have a look at our services, have a look at our website. I think you are going to find it interesting at a very, very good price. But I am not here to talk about our company. I am here to talk about an open source project, a very interesting open source project that I think you are going to like. So we are in a technical conference. Why I am talking about an IDE? Why I am talking about GitPod? Well, because right now, okay, everybody works on the cloud. We have containers everywhere. We are building things. You, as developers, are building things in the cloud, but we are almost developing like 30 years ago. That was my old IBM computer when I was a child. And we are still installing developer environment in our computer. We are still installing compilers. We are still installing almost everything in order to be able to develop and test the code we are developing. And it takes time. It takes effort. Maybe we could do it different. Maybe we could do it in the cloud. OK, that was really a bit marketing bullcrap. We are in a technical talk. Let's talk technical. Today, in 2021, I think most developers will say that they need high-end computers in order to do their job in a correct way. If you are a Java computer, you will need your IntelliJ. You will need some big RAM. We need a good processor, because if you don't have, even to boot up the IDE is going to be a big task, several minutes. Let me tell you one story, one almost real story. I have changed names and all that. Hey, next week you are going to begin a new project. You work as contractor for a new customer. And for the new project, you are going to work with a very nice big application that has a bit of almost everything, like real big application today, because everything is distributed systems today. You have a Redis, you have a MySQL or a MariaDB, you have some Java backend, you have some RabbitMQ in order to make everything communicate, you have maybe some code in Python to do some treatment, some machine learning thing, maybe some Go, and here you have your computer. 8 GB of RAM. OK, first thing, you need to install everything in order to make all that work on your laptop. Second thing, even after losing an evening to install everything, you arrive the first day, you begin to work, and it is going to be painfully slow. And what's the answer? Hey, I need a 16 or 32 gigabyte of RAM computer. Maybe. I need a MacBook Pro, 6,000 pounds MacBook Pro last generation in order to write some code. Well, some time ago, containers had changed the way how we develop. We can test things easier. We can install some containers. You don't need to find the right version of Redis or MariaDB for your computer that is compatible with the version you are using in production. You have containers. You take the right image and you run it on your computer. It made things for us developers really easier. It makes things even for sysadmin and DevOps easier because they don't have the "it works in my computer" problem. And we are able to put in a laptop like this one very complex architectures because, A, you can deploy containers, and if you have lots and lots of containers to deploy and to make communicate, you use things like Docker Swarm, Kubernetes. You can install all that in your computer, and it is going to work. Well, it's going to work. It's still your laptop. So as I told before, you are going to need lots and lots of CPU and RAM. But it can be done with a high-end computer. Well, it can be done, but it's also going to take some time and energy and skill, because I am not sure if every developer today is going to be able to install Kubernetes and all the different containers and make it work in order to test their next distributed application. In an ideal world, all that wouldn't be needed. We have all a production environment, some integration testing environment. Why we don't have a real development environment that you can simply use from a web browser, for example? The idea is, for me, better than needing a 5,000 pounds computer to develop some code. It will be simply having developer environments as a service. When you can develop, you can test, you can do anything you need to do for your day job without installing anything in your computer. Even on a small MacBook Air or a Chromebook or anything, really, even on an iPad. And for me, that changed the way that we develop. But it is an ideal world. Well, for me, the answer to this ideal world is GitPod. GitPod is literally that, an development environment as a service that runs on a browser, and it's fully open source. That means you can prepare your development environment for all the people in your team, right, and allows them to begin the project, open the web browser, launch their GitPod workspace, and begin to work from a small computer, from a big one, without having to install anything. I am going to explain you why and how I did find out about GitPod and what are their advantages. The idea is having at the beginning, it began as a fully IDE running in a browser tab. It was based on Eclipse Theia. Right now, it is based on Visual Studio Code. And they wanted to do more than simply giving you a code editor in the web. They wanted a full development environment. So they added workspaces. The idea is you will be able to execute on your Gitpod workspace any container, you will give them a Docker file or a Docker swarm, and it is going to build everything in your Docker file or in your Docker swarm definition, Docker Compose, and it is going to deploy that for you in your Gitpod workspace. So when you arrive to your Gitpod workspace, you will have the code editor and all the software and all the continuous integration you need in order to properly test your code. So, as I told, it is more than simply an editor. It is more of a developer environment. And you can use it from any web browser. Chromebook, a small computer, iPad, and I have done it in iPad when I am traveling. It is not as wonderful as in a computer because in iPad you don't have a real keyboard with all the needed keys and all that, but it works. How it works? How it does that magic thing? Well, Gitpod, as the first part of the name can give you a clue, it is based on Git. The idea is you will begin with a Git repository. For the software as a service version, you will have a GitLab, GitHub, or Bitbucket repository, and it is going to build a workspace from the repository, including the code of the repository and all the containers that you put in a Docker file definition in this repository. As it is based on Git, you can create a workspace from any version, any commit, any branch, any pull request from your repository. You can create as many workspaces as you want from a given repository. As it is based on GitHub, GitLab, Bitbucket, you will be able to create it from any repository, public or private, you can access. So you can use it in your private repository. People will use, for the software as a service, the GitHub, GitLab, or Bitbucket authentication. And from any private repository of your company, create their workspace. And of course, I told you it is open source. You can deploy it in your own infrastructures or in a cloud provider. And then you can access any other private Git repository, not only the big one, but the one you have installed in a corner in your office. By default, if you go to a GitHub repository and you open a Gitpod from it, it is going to create a by default image, the workspace full Gitpod image. This image has tools for most web development. I mean, you have a container who has Node running, you have Python running, you have many different tools. And for many web development projects, the by default image is enough. So you don't need to do anything. But let's say you are Java developers, we are at DevOps, and you want to have a specific version of the JDK and some other nice software, well, then you are going to add two optional configuration files, .gitpod.dockerfile and .gitpod.yaml. The first one, you are going to define the base container that will run in your Gitpod. You can begin from any container, from the by default image, from any other you want. You create your Docker file, and in the YAML, you are going to define some commands you want to execute at the beginning that aren't in the Docker file. For example, you can define to mount some folders, or you can define to include some variables, some system variables, or anything else. With only these two files, you can tune your Gitpod workspace exactly for your need. But as I told before, for many sample needs, the by default image is more than enough. So you create a workspace, as I told, from any point of your Git repository, any branch, any pull request, whatever. You can create as many workspaces as you want, and you can share your workspaces. I mean, I have created a workspace from this commit. I do some modification, I test something. Hey, it is nice for me. I would like my team leader to see what I have done and give me some feedback. You can share your workspace, and the team leader will be able to open it exactly at this point and discuss with it. So you have also the shareable part that is really interesting. Another one, you can open several workspaces, one in every browser tab, and communicate between them. That means you can, I open one workspace with the current version of the backend, I open another workspace with the frontend, I do some modification in the frontend, in the backend, and I test the whole system with different workspaces that are from different GitHub projects. You can test everything. You can have, for example, if you have a complex project that we said before, a project from the front end, another for the back end, another for the database. You open all of them in different browser tabs, and you test your whole system without deploying a full-scale environment. And that is really powerful. Hey, OK, I have sold you some magic. What is the price of the magic? Well, the software as a service version, first of all, as I told you, I don't work for them, so no problem about that. It has a very interesting free plan that you can use for 50 hours a month. For many use cases, it is more than enough. If you want to do some quick test, if you want to do a formation, an onboarding for a new employee, things like that, the free plan is really, really useful. If you begin to use it every day, the personal or the professional plan are very interesting. But for me, there are two things that make it really wonderful. The free professional open source plan. That means if you have an open source project, you can talk with GitPod to make it free to use GitPod on your open source project without limit of people, of hours, of anything. That means that people could contribute to your project without any problem, without installing nothing in their laptop. It makes the barrier to begin contributing to an open source project really, really low. Another, it is open source. You can self-install it. You can install it in any Kubernetes. And we will talk about that later. Right now, it is rather easy to install. So you can self-install it for you, for your company. And if you want support, you can also get a support plan for the self-installed. So it is rather flexible. I have used it mostly with the free plan and the self-installed plan. But the open source has been getting really some big attention this last time because it makes really easy to begin to contribute. So why I got interested in that? Well, I got interested because of a conference. Last year, during the lockdown, I was asked to do a hands-on lab in a conference. Well, a hands-on lab about web component. Before the pandemics, I did it in conferences, in small rooms with maybe 20 people, so I could go and explain, hey, no, you need the last version of Node in order to do this lab. Maybe you should use another, you have a problem downloading the dependencies, you don't have enough bandwidth. What about that? I have a USB dongle with everything you need. I could do this kind of things. During the lockdown, I was going to have some 100 people from the other side of the world in their own computer without any control of which software they had in the computer or the specification of the computer. I needed to find a solution in order to do this lab. And a friend told me about GitPod, so I decided to try. I had a GitHub project from my lab, for my hands-on lab, so I simply opened GitPod, and directly it worked. Why? Because it was a very simple web development project. I only used Node, TypeScript, some Node dependencies. The by default was more than enough. I tested my lab, and the day of the conference, I simply give people my GitHub repository with a nice button open with GitPod. Everybody was able to use it. They created a GitPod account with the GitHub, GitLab, Bitbucket account. They had the 50 free hours. My lab was 2 hours. They were able to follow. They were able to continue after the lab. And they were able to share me their workspace if they had a problem. It was simple. It was so simple that I told myself, I can use it for another problem I have. And another problem I had was, I work for OVH Cloud. We have a managed Kubernetes solution, and I needed to do some formation, some teaching about that, teaching people, teaching developers to use Kubernetes on our solution. And why it was difficult? Because in order to do it, I needed these people to have some command line tools, kubectl, Elm, whatever. And many people had corporate locked laptops, and they weren't able to install nothing. And they weren't able to install things also because they didn't know how to install this one and this one. So I wanted to teach them to use our managed Kubernetes platform, but I didn't want to do some basic IT job in order to be able to teach. So what I did, I created a GitHub project, and I defined a Docker file, simply an empty project with a Docker file. When I began with a Linux image, and I added all the tooling needed in order to deal with Kubernetes, kubectl, K9s in order to better manage all that, Elm, customize, whatever, in a Docker file. And at the beginning of the formation, I give them the GitHub. Please click on the Open in GitPod button. They opened my project in GitPod with the right Docker file, and they had a terminal and a code editor in order to write those nice YAML files in order to follow the whole formation without installing anything in the laptop, in the corporate laptop, in a tablet, whatever. So they could center themselves in learning about Kubernetes and not learning how to install all the tooling. Since that, I have used this for almost all the training I have done and all the labs I have organized for both front-end, back-end, and cloud-related projects. And it has made my life really, really easier. That was the one I used. Let me show you. Because it is easier to show. So that was the original tutorial, a tutorial to learn a stencil library of web components. And for me, the tutorial was easy. I had 8 steps, and I had in every step the code. At the end, they were going to have a nice catalog of beers. Beers are important. I simply added this and this. As you can maybe see Let me try to make it more easy. Well, no, it is still too small. I am simply calling a gitpod.io URL, giving as parameters my repository. You can, if I give my repository, it is going to open the main. If I give my repository / a commit ID, it's going to open the commit ID. So I open in Gitpod. I am doing it in real time. I haven't opened this project in the last 2 weeks, so it is completely, it is in sleep. It is going to create my workspace. It has taken 1 minute. And here I have my whole Gitpod environment. I am an older person now, so I use the Lite 10 for Visual Studio Code, but it is a fully featured Visual Studio Code. And if, like many people, you don't like the 10, we can also, you have the properties, you can change preferences, color theme. Hey, let's go like a real developer. So you have a Visual Studio Code, fully featured. And here I have a terminal. And let's say I have tried to see the last step. Up. I have access to all my code, and I can do things like npm install. It is way faster than on my laptop. That's another nice perk, because they have a broadband connection, so Maven install, npm install, and all that is rather fast. And I can simply npm start. And it has opened an internal browser that is going to connect to my project. And here I have my code running. But I can also take that and open another and access it from everywhere. So nothing is running in my computer, but for me, it's a very similar experience to the one I have every day when developing, without having to install anything. Open 20 minutes, not bad. Another use case, because we began with the other one, and then I began to talk with other developers. Another use case that was important was the onboarding of new people, especially contractors. You are going to have people that are going to stay with your company for 2 weeks. You can make two things. You can either pre-install and give them a laptop with everything they need and the right security access and all that. You can ask them to install everything in their company laptop. Anyways, it is going to take a lot of time and a lot of complexity in order to do some code for your project. For me, it will be easier to simply, for your project, create the right Docker files and use simply Gitpod. They can use in their normal computer. They can use it in an empty new computer. They don't need to install anything. You don't need to give them any special permission beside the authentication and the repository access. If they have access to the repository, they can code. If they haven't access, they can't code. And they will be operational from the first hour of their arrival. You are going to waste less time, and they aren't going to waste any time in order to begin. My Managed Kubernetes course. And another nice feature was to be able to replicate any workspace and share it. I mean, I am adding a new feature. I am not sure that my team leader or my product owner or even the people from user experience are going to like it. Hey, you can do any small modification, you can do whatever you want, and give and share them the workspace, and they will be able to access directly to your code and test it. And maybe make either some change in your code and give you back the workspace. You are able to collaborate in a different way. We have all done the classic, I do a pull request and I wait for the question, for the review of the pull request, I modify and you can use GitPod as an early stage pull request, almost like in a form of asynchronous peer coding. I am not sure this function should be implemented like that. I do it, I test it, I share the workspace, and the other person is going to give me the comment, to modify, to give me back. You can collaborate in a different way that, especially in a pandemic when doing a real peer coding is complicated, it makes an interesting experience. Also for customers, as I told you, hey, the customers say they have a bug, you think you have fixed it, you send in them the workspace and they can test if their bug is corrected, is fixed, without you having to deploy a new infrastructure or whatever. You only give them the workspace, they are able to test, to validate that you have fixed the new feature. So for me, the idea is, today, most of us code for the cloud. We can do it in the cloud, having all the advantage of the cloud, and be able to code from everywhere without problem. And of course, the software as a service version is nice, but what about installing it? It is open source. Well, before going there, some words of warning. There are good reasons and bad reasons to install GitPod in the open source version. A bad reason would be, I want to spend less. I want to be cheap. Well, if you are going to install GitPod in your infrastructure or in a cloud provider, you are going to need to administer it. And it isn't as easy as it could seem. So you aren't really going to gain or many money on that. You will need to be able to install and to administer it, to do the backups, maybe all those things. For me, the real good reason in order to use the open source version instead of the software as a service version is a practical one. You have your own repositories. You are working in code that you cannot put in GitHub or GitLab, even in private version. Then it makes sense to have also your own GitPod version in your infrastructures. Having something on-premise, being able to fully control all the chain. And that's really, really interesting. What do you need to install GitPod? Well, 2 months ago, I did a similar talk in a French conference, and I told, you are going to need to be a Kubernetes guru, you are going to need a lot of times, because there were some 12 steps, and some of them were rather tricky. But right now, last month, they have released a very simple Helm installer. So there is a Helm chart, and everybody who knows a bit their way of Kubernetes can install it in 1 hour without any particular problem. So yes, you need to have some Kubernetes skill, but it is really rather easy. As usual, when talking about Kubernetes, Another word of advice, please don't install a Kubernetes only to install GitPod on it. If you aren't a Kubernetes expert, use a managed Kubernetes solution. Our managed Kubernetes solution or any other, they are all certified, they are all similar, but don't try to administer your Kubernetes yourself only to do GitPod. Administering Kubernetes is rather tricky, especially at the beginning. It isn't worth for this kind of task. So I have done many examples in that's the publicity slide of my talk, of course. But if you don't know which one to use, look at ours. It is simple to use, it is inexpensive, it is very cost effective, and it is going to work. So you install it on Kubernetes, and wait, one more thing. Because sometimes you want a full GitPod environment. You want to be able to test, to code, to deploy anything. Sometimes you only have some sample needs. You want to give people access to a Visual Studio Code with several extensions pre-configured and everything they need to code. And you only are interested in coding. Why? Because you have your own CI/CD pipeline and you have your own test infrastructure. You don't want to multiply that. Why am I talking about that? Well, because 2 weeks ago, people at GitPod announced the release of a new project, Open Visual Studio Code Server. It is a fully cloud version or a fully remote version of Visual Studio Code that runs in a browser. Why does this new? Microsoft is doing that for years. Well, but the things Microsoft are doing aren't based on the open source version of Visual Studio Code. So you cannot do it yourself. With this project, you are able to install in any virtual machine, in any place where you have Docker, you can deploy a server version of Visual Studio Code that you can access in your tab. It's fully open source. There is no software as a service version. It is the open source project initiated by GitPod, but many other actors have been joining in the last 2 weeks. It is in GitHub, and it simply works. And when I say it simply works, I say that you can have a part of what GitPod does. I mean, GitPod, it is really two things. It is the workspace idea, getting the code from your repository, giving you the different Docker containers in order to fully test that. But it is also the online Visual Studio Code. And they are beginning to separate them. Why? Because many people are using the workspace part without using the Visual Studio Code. Why? Because they are connecting, for example, by SSH in order to use VI, because they like to code in VI, or because they don't use GitPod for developing. They use it only for testing. They don't need the Visual Studio Code. They connect by SSH. They have the container. They can do everything they want in this container. They are using their own Visual Studio Code in local and use the remote developing in order to do that. Or they are also working with JetBrains in order to have the JetBrains IDEs connected directly to the workspace. So for them, it makes sense to say, hey, GitPod is more than an IDE. So this part, the IDE, we fully take it out of that and we offer as an independent project. So right now, GitPod is built on Open Visual Studio Code Server. And it is really, really simple to deploy. No Kubernetes needed, only a Docker. You run it in any computer, your laptop, a virtual machine, anything, able to run Docker, and you can then access directly to your Visual Studio Code. It makes things easier when you only want to get an editor anywhere, and of course, you can take the image and customize it with all the extensions and all the environment variables you need in order to tailor the experience to your specific use case. So it is going to allowing a different way to create that. And before ending, some people, I asked with some people just before the talk, hey, but you are talking about something that is very, very similar to GitHub code spaces. How does compare? I'm sorry, I haven't got time to do the slide about that because I was at the booth. But, well, they are both similar and very different. They are similar. They allow you a full development environment in the cloud. And the difference ends there. OK, they both use Visual Studio Code. And the difference ends then. Why? Because today, for code spaces, as an individual developer, you cannot use it. It is for teams. And it is way more expensive. Don't take my word on it. Look at it. And it is only for GitHub projects. And it isn't open source. I mean, if you are fully GitHub, working on teams, and your company accepts to pay the price to Microsoft, Codespaces is great. GitPod is another philosophy. It is open source. So if you want, you can have it fully for free. The software as a service version have cheap plans, so you can test it. You can use it as an individual developer, not only for the repository of your company. It is linked to your account. You can use it in any repository you want. If you are doing open source, it is free for all open source projects, and you can install it by yourself, or you can use it the software as a service version. So for me, both projects are similar. One project has all the power of Microsoft and GitHub behind it. The other is more independent, but many actors are already using it, and it is more flexible and more open. And I think, hey, I have some minutes for questions, for comments, maybe for testing something other things in a demo. There are any questions? Yes, please.
That was a very good talk. I've not used GitPod before, and so it was very lovely to see the actual talk. So my question is, the workspace, is that immutable or mutable? How does it relate to a commit? You have a commit on your GitHub. You create a...
the workspace, it begins its life from a commit, and since that, it is fully mutable. The commit is only the beginning point of a workspace, so you can take your workspace from a commit, do some modifications, share it with others, and the project is continuing to life. The idea is, from the workspace, you can create a pull request or commit back, but the workspace, it's fully independent once created.
I have one more question.
Yeah, of course.
How does the security is handled between GitHub and the GitPod workspace?
The GitPod workspace in the software as a service version, the GitPod workspace are linked to your GitPod identity that with OpenID, it is linked either to your GitHub, GitLab, or Bitbucket account. So you can access to your own workspaces, and you can create a workspace from any repository where you have access. And you can share your workspace with some other GitPod user, and then both of you can access that workspace. In the self-installed version, if you want to use authentication and permissions, you are going to base then on key clock in your install. So if you already have users and roles on key clock, you can use an existing key clock, But if not, it is going to install a very basic one where you can create users as you want. You're welcome. Any other question? Yes? Please, we have some time.
Tell us something about the database, the architecture behind it. Is that microservices? How the communication goes between elements in there?
OK, about databases. You can deploy anything you can put in a Docker file. So you could, and some people for quick test use, put your database on a container memory with an in-memory storage and use a full GitPod infrastructure for basic test. When you aren't putting a lot of data in your database, it is going to work well. Myself, I prefer to use an external database, a database as a service, or anything like that. Why? Because if you want really to test, you usually want to have some consequent big test data sets, and it works better. It is a bit slow to put that on a container, to run the container, put all the data on it, but it can be done. It is, for me, the right workflow is to use an external database if you want to test with some real data, and only use the full-on Docker approach for a small development test and all that.
And if you want to deploy this on your prem, what kind of database would you need to integrate with?
If you are deploying Gitpod on-premise, you don't need any special database. It is going to run on Kubernetes. You need to have in your Kubernetes some kind of persistent storage, and it is going to install everything. You don't need an external database for that. It is fully on Kubernetes. So as long as your Kubernetes accepts any persistent storage, persistent volume, it is going to work.
Yes, I was just going to ask, yeah, I really enjoyed the talk. If you have multiple services that need to communicate with each other, i.e. some microservices or something, would each one be in a workspace and then you'd have to make sure that they'd be able to communicate that way? How do they authenticate?
Well, if you have microservices, you can open different workspaces, and then my favorite way to do that is environment variables. Because the right way to do that, I think I haven't told about, you are creating from the same repository many different workspaces for many different users. What about credentials and things like that you don't want to put in Git? Well, for all that, it's accept environment variables that you can define well to get it with authentication, and then everybody is running their own workspace, but with different environment variables. And same thing, when you have different services, you put in environment variables the address of all the others, and they can communicate like that.
I see. So it's almost like a development or a staging environment.
Yeah.
But the local is now.
So I think time is up. Thank you very, very much. I hope you like it. And if you want to talk, I will be at OVH Cloud booth for the day. Thank you very, very much.